Okay, this presentation, we're going to look at miracles and the apologetic value of miracles. We're going to look at some common questions and objections and also look at some definitions as well. This was done as part of our apologetics ministry at The Ohio State University and Columbus State Community College. Well, given that miracles plays a huge role in biblical faith, there have been plenty of criticisms in the scientific realm, in the philosophical arena, and in theological studies, and so there's been a slew of books that have been written that talk about miracles, that handles some of the criticisms and deals with the big questions surrounding miracles. So any of these books will help you in answering those questions and objections, and they will help you sharpen your skills and just thinking about the role of miracles in the Bible. If you get the bottom one in the middle, Hume's Abject Failure, that's an important book because David Hume has had a huge impact in the academic realm on how people view miracles, and that book kind of tackles him head on. Even actually the guy that wrote that book is not really he's not a Christian anyway. So it's very important to understand how to respond to David Hume and some of his arguments. So these books are all excellent resources. Some more current books that have come out over the last 3 to 5 years, or these books right here, or 1 to 5 years, I'm sorry. The Ian Hutchinson book on the bottom, Can a Scientist Believe in Miracles? I have read that book. It's really well done. And then you have a popular level book like Lee Strobel's A Case for Miracles, and then the one on the far right called Miracles. So there's been more than enough books that have been written on this topic if you want to go deeper in your studies. I do think it's important to know how to articulate the role of miracles in the Bible and how to deal with the objections that we hear against miracles in the popular culture around us. So let's talk about some preliminary issues. One issue that certainly plays a role in how we evaluate miracles is a worldview. This is one of the most popular books that's ever been written, The Universe Next Door by James Sire. This is his 5th edition. He says a worldview is our set of presuppositions about the basic makeup of our world. And a worldview or vision of life is a framework or a set of fundamental beliefs through which we view the world and our calling and future in it. So worldview is the way we view reality, and it's definitely going to play a huge role in how we evaluate miracles, whether we believe miracles are possible or whether we believe there's a God who intervenes into history and uses miracles for a certain purpose. Our worldview will play a huge role in that topic. So we're talking about our worldviews or background beliefs. Many people do have a worldview. Sometimes they don't even know they have one. They may not even be familiarized with the different kinds of worldviews, but everybody has some kind of worldview, or else they're developing a worldview. We might want to ask ourselves how our worldview affects our approach to miracles. Will we prejudge the issue to begin with? Maybe our worldview will not allow us to evaluate miracles in a proper fashion. It just depends on what our worldview is. We'll talk about that more as we go on here. And so that's the things we want to keep in mind, because I have found over the years the biggest thing that keeps people from believing Jesus rose from the dead and some of these other miraculous claims we make are probably related to a worldview issue. It's just you cannot get around the worldview topic when you're talking about miracles. Now, these are the 5 big worldview questions, and if you look at the chart here, on one side is a view that has no God in the mix. On the other side, there is a God. And so when it comes to answering these 5 big questions and looking at a general overview here, we see that on the far right, if you believe God or you think that God answers those 5 worldview questions, then of course you're going to be open to the fact that God could intervene into human history. Of course, you're already open to that to begin with. But from a materialistic worldview or an atheistic worldview on the other side, if there is no God, that's kind of the way you would answer some of those questions. And like I said, this is just a general overview. But these are the kinds of questions that kind of form the background of whether someone's going to be open to God raising a man from the dead or doing something in human history. And so I always challenge people to see where they're at in these 5 questions, because I know that's going to frame the discussion on whether they're open to see if God has raised a man from the dead or intervened into human history. Now, Thomas Jefferson was a very interesting person. He actually, in the Jefferson Bible, as we know, he actually tore out a lot of the pages of that Bible, and I mean of the Bible, I should say. But then in the Jefferson Bible, as it is now known, it really included nothing about Jesus's divinity. And then he had in those 2 volumes, The Philosophy of Jesus of Nazareth and The Life and Morals of Jesus of Nazareth, he edited out biblical passages he considered over the top or that offended his Enlightenment sense of reason. So Jefferson was very influenced by the Enlightenment, and he obviously he believed that God existed. He believed in the existence of God, but he did not believe God was intervening into history through the person of Jesus. He also was very influenced by the role of the relationship between church and state. He did not think the government should impose any kind of belief or anything on religion of any individual. So he didn't like what was going on in his own time of the interaction between the church and the state. And so that led to him to kind of rip out some of these passages in the Bible where God is actually intervening into human history through the person of Jesus. That God is a God who interacts in the world he's involved versus a deistic God. So remember, he was a product of his time, but it's very interesting that he had such a reaction that he actually tore out some of the passages about Jesus's miracles in the Bible. So just a little tidbit there. So Paul says here in 1 Corinthians 15, if Jesus has not been raised from the dead, we are still in our sins. Our faith is worthless. He talks about the seriousness about the resurrection here. And so there's no doubt that if Jesus did not rise from the dead, meaning that if God did not intervene into history through the person of Jesus, meaning that there is a miracle of the resurrection, then we are all still dead in our sins. So I hope you understand the importance of miracles. William Lane Craig, who's going to go down probably as one of the most well-known or famous Christian apologists in the last 50 years, he's done countless debates. He said at the beginning of his faith, when he was examining the Christian faith, he said the virgin block was the biggest stumbling block to him. He just thought that he couldn't believe such a thing. He thought it was just impossible to believe. But then he started looking at cosmology, he started looking at the universe, and then he realized, well, if God could create the universe, so there is a first cause that came from a mind or a personal being, then it really would be child's play for God to impregnate a woman. So he thinks that, or he says that's the thing that got him over the hump to really be open to God doing other things once he realized God created the universe. So what he was saying was at the beginning of the universe, from his arguments, I'm not going to do a detailed presentation on his arguments, but the point is that he was saying since the beginning of the universe, it was a result of a free act of will by an immaterial conscious agent who can exist outside space and time, then we should be open to that being doing other things within human history. Because we know at the beginning of the universe, the laws of nature come into existence, and we know the existence and precise nature of these laws cannot be explained by science, and science presupposes them. Science can't even get off the ground without the laws of nature. They have to come into existence, and they have to be there for science to do anything. So when it comes to the beginning of the universe, if you want to go deeper on studying some of the arguments, these are some of the latest books that have come out. There's 2 volumes on the Kalam argument by Paul Copon and William Lane Craig. There's a series of essays, and both of these books by actually there's some responses. It's not written by just Christians. There's a philosophical volume here, then a scientific volume. And then Andrew Loke here on the bottom is a kind of newer to the debate, but he has a book called God and Ultimate Origins. So you can get that book as well, but there's more than enough out there to look at the beginning of the universe. I know there's arguments against it. I know that there's debates about it. But the point is that you can look into it deeper, and I think you will arrive, hopefully you will see that the best explanation for the beginning of the universe is a conscious being who is personal, but I'm not going to go into that any more than now, so you can read some of those books and see what you think. But you know, Paul Davies, who is a physicist at Arizona State, he's not a Christian. He wrote this article a ways back in the New York Times in November 2007. It's interesting that he said, all science proceeds on the assumption that nature is ordered in a rational, intelligible way. He observed the scientists take the orderly laws of physics on faith and that these laws are expressed as tidy mathematical relationships. He then asked the questions he's not supposed to ask. Where do these laws come from, and why do they have the form that they do? So Davies is not a believer, as I said, but he admitted the fact that science gets off the ground or just assumes these laws are there and they are quite rational, intelligible, but he says we just really take them on faith alone. We don't ask where they come from. We just assume they're there. We know they're there, and we just assume that they don't have any explanation. He got a lot of criticism for writing that from atheists because he challenged the paradigm that you couldn't possibly bring God into the mix. So you can read that article online if you want to. So I've noticed over the years when people reject the miracles in the New Testament, sometimes they will say these things. These are some of the common sayings. They might say, I like the teachings and ethics of Jesus, but I don't believe in those miracles. Or the miracles are simply symbolic. They didn't really happen. They're not factual. They're not historical. Or Jesus is no different from Buddha, Gandhi, or another teacher. And so once people kind of strip the miraculous out of the New Testament, then Jesus really isn't that different. So I've seen people do that over the years, and the reasons they do are varied. Of course, maybe they don't want to be accountable to a supernatural Jesus. They don't want to bow their knee to a Jesus who demands things from them. It just depends. But we'll talk about some of the objections as we go along here. Now, I would agree that it is true that we should be skeptical of some of the miracle claims in the world. We're not just going to believe everything, and we are skeptical of other miracle claims in other religions. Obviously, I'm skeptical of Mormon claims and Muslim claims, and I will ask for evidence. So there's nothing wrong with being skeptical and being, we don't want to be gullible, and there's nothing wrong with asking for evidence. So when people ask us for good reasons to believe Jesus rose from the dead or evidence, we should be open to that and not be defensive or critical. We do the same thing with other world religions as well. So just remember that want to keep this in mind when people approach you and ask you questions, or maybe they're skeptical of your miraculous claims or the claims you're making about the miracles of the Bible. For some people, the miracles in the Bible are equated with the supernatural. And so as soon as this comes into people's minds, sometimes they think of superstition. They think that you believe in the same thing as ghosts and fairies, or it's no different than magic or weird things like belief in Zeus or Thor or other gods. And of course, someone may look at you like, well, how could you possibly believe there's anything outside the natural world? I mean, after all, they might say, we know in science now that science has shown there is nothing outside the natural world. We'll talk about an objection as we go on here. But just remember, this is what sometimes comes into people's minds when they hear the word miracle. Let's look at a couple different definitions of miracle, because sometimes that's important on how to define it, how to define a miracle. In my opinion, at least, it's important. Philosopher and apologist Francis Beckworth, he states that a miracle is a divine intervention that occurs contrary to the regular course of nature within a significant historical and religious context. I think that's a pretty good definition. Michael Licona, who I've had at Ohio State, says here, I define miracle as an event in history for which natural explanations are inadequate, and propose that we may identify a miracle when the event is highly unlikely to have occurred given the circumstances and or natural law, and occurred in an environmental context charged with religious significance. Now, notice both of these definitions say miracles need a historical and religious context to them, and that's very important, because when people come to you and they say, well, do you believe in Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster and other silly things that are superstitious, just remember that Bigfoot or the Loch Ness Monster has no religious or historical context. The life of Jesus is in a very specific religious and historical context, and we can examine it in that context. But I don't really have any context for weird things like Bigfoot or Loch Ness Monster, so that's kind of a silly objection. Maybe you've never heard it, but I've heard it. Also, when it comes to defining a miracle, we need to remember that miracles are not the same thing as anomalies or magic, or they're not psychosomatic. They're not the same thing as satanic signs or providence. These are some of the things we see in the Bible, or some of the things people think are the same thing as miracles. Maybe they're exact same thing, but they're not. We want to go to that far right column where we say miracles. They never fail. They last. They're permanent. They last permanently, and also they always bring glory to God. They're not done for entertainment, and they're a one-time rare event. So we need to understand these things because some people get confused in how to define a miracle. Now, when it comes to biblical faith, we look in the Bible or biblical theology. In the New Testament, the three terms we tend to translate into miracle are these words: sign, wonder, and power. You see this in Acts 2:22, where it says Jesus was a man accredited by God to you by miracles, wonders, and signs, which God did through him, as you yourselves know. So when you look up the word miracle in the Bible, you're probably going to see these three words always in both testaments, even in the time of Moses or the time of Jesus. It's always associated with sign, wonder, and power. Okay. Now, some people might say today, why won't God show me a sign? I'll talk about that in another presentation coming up after this one. We need to remember that God is not obligated to give you a sign if you're not open to be transformed and you really don't want to surrender your will to him. We'll see this in a little bit, of course, that people in the Bible, many times miracles were done and it didn't change hardened hearts. It didn't necessarily cause people to follow God. Sometimes it did, sometimes it didn't. So we'll talk about this more in detail in a presentation after this. So just remember, if you're not open to transformation, you don't want to yield to God, God is under no obligation to give you a sign. As I said before, miracles are not anomalies of nature. Some people think miracles are an anomaly. They're not. Miracles must not be confused with a natural anomaly like a lunar eclipse. Miracles are not naturally repeatable. Anomalies are predictable. For example, the flight of the bumblebee was an anomaly for many years, but since it occurred regularly, it was predictable even before it was explainable. And of course, anomalies lack the theological, moral, and teleological dimension of miracles. Miracles are definitely not the same thing as magic. I've heard over the years that Jesus is a magician. He's like a magic trickster, but that's a misunderstanding of the context of his miracles. Magical tricks involve innocent deception, but miracles involve no deception. Magic has a purely natural explanation. Miracles do not. A miracle is under God's control, whereas magic is under human control. And remember, occult magic always brings glory to the magician and psychosomatic cures to the one who performs them, but miracles always bring glory to God. Now let's talk a little bit about where people may use the term miracles and assume something's a miracle and it's really not. Of course, seeing your child born is one of the most amazing things you'll ever see in your entire life, but technically it's not a miracle. It happens regularly. It's not a rare event. We know people are born every day. Obviously, it can bring glory to God. I mean, when my children were born, I thank God all day long, but it's not necessarily the same thing as a biblical miracle. God is using natural processes to bring that child into the world. It's not necessarily a rare event or divine intervention every time, but I mean, I know someone may disagree with me. I'm not saying God is not behind the birth of a child at all. I'm just saying technically it's not a biblical miracle the way we define miracles in the Bible. We're coming close to being hit by a car, but barely missing it is not necessarily a miracle as well. That's an issue, probably more of a providential issue, which I'll talk about in a minute. So we need to remember that rare events are not miraculous simply by virtue of being rare. Unexplainable events are not miraculous just because they are unexplained. To be able to say an event is a true miracle, there must be a causal connection back to God. So providence is God's guiding hand in human affairs and thus is also not miraculous. Miracles occur when nature is uninterrupted in some way. I know there's a fine line between some of these definitions. I'm not trying to be overly technical and I'm not trying to be, criticize those if they say, well, that's a miracle if I didn't get hit by a car. I'm not saying that's you should be corrected or something. I'm just saying, trying to give some proper definitions here. I think God's providential hand is involved in a lot of things, but some of these things are not necessarily rare events. Also in the Bible, remember that the biblical authors do not make a distinction between the supernatural and natural. They didn't walk around and say, well, that's supernatural or, oh, that's natural. That distinction came as a result of the Enlightenment. came much later in history. For example, like when it says the parting of the Red Sea was caused by a strong east wind blowing all night, that's God behind the world of nature using secondary causation. So just remember, the biblical authors don't necessarily do what we do today as far as making that sharp distinction. There are various time periods of miracles in the Bible. We see the time of Moses, we see the prophetic period, and we see the apostolic period. So it seems that God is giving new revelation to Israel's history, and when he does it, he raises up a prophet. He speaks through that prophet. He does signs through that prophet to show that new revelation is breaking in. But of course, these periods of history are over, and there's no need for new revelation. So therefore, God is not necessarily needing to bring new revelation into humanity. It was completed in the person and work of Jesus. And so for those that say God's giving new revelation today, I would respond, that is why we have so many cults, because people think that God's raising up new prophets and forming new religious movements. So that's why the world is very confused. So if we read the Bible, though, we will see that God's miraculous activity as far as confirming new revelation ended in the person of Jesus. Now, he can do miracles today, but he doesn't need to bring any new revelation. All miracles only confirm what was already done in the Bible to begin with. When it comes to Jesus, obviously his miracles play a huge role in his ministry. There's more than enough that's been written about this. When it comes to his nature miracles and his work as an exorcist, there's not a lot of debate whether Jesus was some sort of exorcist or physical healer, but the debate is over his nature miracles. For example, the miracles where he's walking on water or feeding the 5,000, that is an issue where a lot of scholars have a lot of disagreement, and they have a hard time with it because their worldview plays a role in how they interpret those events. But there's no doubt that many scholars believe Jesus was some sort of exorcist or some sort of miracle worker or healer. They have a hard time with the nature miracles. So you can see these quotes right here. There's general agreement that Jesus did perform exorcism or did some sort of healing. So not a lot of debate about that, as I just said. Now, Rudolf Bultmann, who was a well-known New Testament scholar, he forever impacted New Testament studies in the realm of German scholarship. He actually tried to demythologize the New Testament, and what he did was he stripped out the miracles of the New Testament, and he said that it was impossible to use electric light and the wireless to avail ourselves of modern medical surgical devices. And then he said that at the same time, to believe, we couldn't do that and believe in the New Testament world of spirits and miracles. And so here we see someone that made a quote that forever impacted New Testament studies. And part of the issue is that what's interesting here is that he definitely believed that Jesus was a real person, but because of his worldview, he simply didn't believe it was possible to believe in the miraculous events in the New Testament. And a lot of people have kind of followed his train of thought throughout New Testament studies. Not everybody, but certainly he's had a long-lasting impact in New Testament studies. Now, David Hume is another person that's had a huge role in how people view miracles, especially in academia. His works carry on, and his arguments have carried on for a long time. You can read some of his original works here. He was an empiricist. He wasn't saying that miracles are impossible, but it's impossible to prove them. And he just basically said that evidence that miracles do not happen outweigh evidence that they do happen. One point that Hume made was that no miracle in history has been attested by a sufficient number of men of such unquestioned good sense, education, and learning as to secure us against all delusion in themselves of such undoubted integrity as to place them beyond all suspicion of any design to deceive others. So Hume made this argument, and of course this is carried on for a long time. So he would say, just like a guy here, like it's similar, the similar arguments made by this gentleman here, Jerry Coyne of the University of Chicago. He's an atheist. He said in his book, Fact versus Faith, Why Science and Religion Are Incompatible, he said, it would be a closed-minded scientist who would say that miracles are impossible in principle. He adds, to have real confidence in a miracle, one needs evidence, massive, well-documented, and either replicable or independently corroborated evidence from multiple and reliable sources. His conclusions, no religious miracle comes even close to meeting those standards. So here we have someone that's basically used Hume's argument. He may not know he is using Hume's argument, but it's basically the same thing. And so let's say you have all these multiple witnesses in the New Testament, and they're an independent tradition, such as right here to Jesus' resurrection. But according to Hume and Coyne, there's just not enough evidence. This is not good enough. You can't have, we have these independent sources. We have many sources in the New Testament, many witnesses to his resurrection, but that's just not going to cut it. So what we see their hyper-skepticism towards the miraculous. Hume also said there must be uniform experience against every miraculous event, otherwise the event would not merit that appellation. And he said, and as uniform experience amounts to a proof, there is here a direct and full proof from the nature of the fact against the existence of any miracle, nor can such a proof be destroyed or the miracle rendered credible, but by an opposite proof which is superior. So this argument has problems because Hume is assuming that nature is uniform, but how does he know that? And then he takes that presupposition, he applies it to everything, and then he assumes miracle reports are all false because nature is uniform. But there is no good evidence that nature is perfectly uniform. Obviously, we have uniformity, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that miracles are impossible, that nature cannot be interrupted in some way or something. If there's a God, obviously God can do what he wants with nature. If I put my hand and throw a phone up in the air, I just intervene into the law of gravity, even though gravity didn't stop. And so Hume's argument is kind of circular there. Another objection by Hume, he said here, number one, natural law is by definition a description of a regular occurrence. A miracle by definition is a rare occurrence. He said the evidence for the regular is always greater than that for the rare. He said a wise man always bases his belief on the greater evidence, therefore a wise man should never believe in miracles. Of course, this is a flawed argument, because it is not true that in practice that the evidence for the general and repeatable is always greater than that for the particular and unrepeatable. We know examples from science that the Big Bang at the beginning of the universe is not based on regular events. It's a rare event, and it's unrepeatable as far as we know. And the origin of life is something that occurred once. It's a singularity. And science, for that matter, studies all kinds of one-time singularities, unrepeatable events. So the evidence is not always greater for the regular than the rare. So Hume's argument, that one is probably, I think, one of his weakest arguments he makes. And then we have the claim, isn't necessarily by Hume, this was said by Carl Sagan, and others have kind of repeated it, that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. So this kind of goes like this. They'll say extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Then they will say the resurrection claim is definitely extraordinary. Therefore, any evidence supporting it ought to be extraordinary as well. They really equivocate on the word extraordinary. They're not really sure sometimes what they mean, at least in my experience. But what they do know is number 5 is whatever evidence you attempt to come up with, it's never going to work with them. It's never going to convince them, and therefore we never have any justification for believing Jesus rose from the dead. So in response to this, we need to remember that if an extraordinary claim means something that is non-natural, it must be shown that natural laws are immutable. However, natural laws are not immutable because they're descriptions of what happens, not prescriptions of what must happen. Natural laws don't cause anything. They only describe what happens in nature. Also, people that make this claim generally confuse deductive and inductive reasoning. They rule out miracles a priori. That's what in the deductive reasoning, they rule them out a priori. And that impacts how they do their induction, how they observe the evidence. So their starting points are that they've kind of ruled out the possibility of the miraculous before even examining the evidence. And so if you're going to do that, then of course that's going to impact how you interpret the evidence if you have an a priori commitment to the non-miraculous or naturalism. For example, this happens with John Dominic Crossan here. He debated William Lane Craig in this book a ways back. I have it on my shelf. He said, a person has a right to say that I live by faith. I by faith believe that God has intervened in the resurrection event, but that's a theological presupposition of mine that God does not operate in that way. So you see his a priori commitment to the non-miraculous. We see the same thing with James Tabor here. He says women do not get pregnant without a male ever. So Jesus had a human father. Dead bodies don't rise. So if the tomb was empty, the historical conclusion is simple. Jesus' body was moved by someone and likely reburied in another location. So there we see his a priori commitment to naturalism and a non-miraculous view of the New Testament. Another common objection is that scientists cannot give up looking for naturalistic explanations for every event. And so to admit there's even a miracle in anything is to give up looking for a natural explanation. Therefore, to admit miracles is to give up being a scientist. The problem with this is that we need to define what science is and what science does. Of course, science, as far as we know it, the current definition is a study of the natural world. Of course, God, by definition, would transcend the natural world. So if God's already ruled out by science and he's not allowed into the scientific realm, whether it be biology, cosmology, geology, or chemistry, or whatever it is, then that means that why use science to say God can't exist when you already ruled out God to begin with? Now, obviously, biblically, we believe that God as an agent can use nature as a mechanism to accomplish his purpose, but science right now really studies only the mechanisms, the naturalistic mechanisms and how they work. And so it's not even set up to really study the existence of God. Now, there's a big debate about that, and that's part of what the intelligent design movement's about. But the point is that if you're going to define science that way, then you can't say that it's disproven God. And sometimes what happens is that science and those people that make that claim, they're really doing philosophy. They're making a metaphysical claim. They're saying the natural or material world is all there is. And then they're trying to use their epistemology to show that claim is true. So they start with their metaphysics and then they jump to their epistemology, but it's really a circular argument because, as I said, science is a study of the natural physical world and it presupposes that before it even does an experiment. This is seen in Hawking's book, The Grand Design. He says the book is rooted in the concept of scientific determinism, which implies there are no miracles or exceptions to the laws of nature. Of course, that is a philosophical assertion, not even a scientific conclusion. So Hawking is doing philosophy there. Another objection that is used against miracles a lot was originally formulated by Ernst Troeltsch. He was a German thinker and sociologist, by the way. And he basically said if we don't have any contemporary experience of the resurrection of a dead person, we have good reasons for believing that no dead man has ever been raised ever in history. So therefore, he basically said the past can only be known by what happens in the present. So if you don't see something happening today, it probably didn't happen in the past. So this argument is completely flawed because obviously if you can only believe things happen in the past because they're happening on a regular basis in today's world, then we would obviously end up rejecting several things from the past because we know that the beginning of the universe and how life got started here are one-time unrepeatable events. There's many things in history that are unrepeatable that we don't see today. And for that matter, he totally misunderstands, or really this argument would just misunderstand the nature of a biblical miracle. If many people were rising from the dead today, there'd be nothing unique about Jesus at all. So if your Uncle John and Grandpa Steve rose from the dead, then that would make Jesus' resurrection not significant. But of course, Jesus' resurrection is a rare event. That's what a miracle is. It's a one-time unrepeatable event. And so this argument's flawed. I had once had someone say to me that well, hey, you don't see people rising from the dead today. Do you see anyone rising from the dead? And I said, no, because Jesus is the only one that's risen from the dead. Now, there are people that are resuscitated today. God can bring them back to life, but they go on to die again. So they're not quite it's not quite the same thing as Jesus' resurrection, because he has gone on to live forever. But the point is that his argument is fairly flawed as well. So I hope this presentation has helped you with your understanding of miracles, and I hope you can use some of this material in your discussions with others. As I said, remember that miracles play a huge role in our faith. They play a huge role in apologetics. So I hope you will go further on this topic. Have a good day.